Okay, as I suggested earlier, Ostrom used her empirical studies of different groups around the world to extract 8 design principles that she thought were applicable for the successful management of any common pool resources. So she took a look at her worldwide database based on empirical studies of different common pool resource groups, and then she proposed 8 principles that capture the essential aspects of successful common pool resource management. So I'm going to walk you through all 8 principles, and the goal of your group project is to try to apply these 8 principles to the extent that you can to your selected common pool resource. So for example, if you chose the phase common room, how are you going to develop a system for managing the common room that takes all 8 of these principles into account? So the first principle that she identified as being a really important feature of successful common pool resource management was clearly defined boundaries. And what she meant by this was that the identity of the group that was supposed to have access to the common pool resource was very clearly defined. And then also the shared resource itself. What was the resource that was at stake in this particular situation? That also needed to be clearly defined. So, for example, if we're talking about a fishery, you would define who are the people who have legitimate access rights to fish in this particular area, but also which fish are being regulated. Does it apply to lobster? Does it apply to lobster and tuna, right? It doesn't matter what the specific details were. What mattered was that in every single case, these boundaries were clearly defined. So clearly defined boundaries, that's principle one. Who gets to use it and what is the it? What is the resource that we're talking about? Those need to be specifically defined. The second principle extracted from the study of successful groups was what they call proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. So what does that mean? Well, that basically means that members of the group have to negotiate a system that rewards members for their contributions. In other words, the amount of reward that you get out of using the common pool resource should be proportional to the amount of value that you put into that system. So in other words, if you're going to be a high status member in this system, you need to earn that. If you're someone who benefits a lot from the common pool resource, that needs to be because you put a lot of value into that common pool resource. So the status of the different users has to be determined by how much value they are actually putting into the resource. It can't be determined by some arbitrary factor. For example, take something like nepotism. Nepotism is when people give other people jobs or give people special benefits because they're related to them. And that's considered unfair because it's not a matter of how much value those people are bringing to the table, but it's a matter of who they know or who they happen to be related to. So successful common pool resource management regimes tend to have systems in place so that the benefits that you get out of the common pool resource are proportional to how much value you put into the system. Any kind of unfair inequality can poison collective efforts. If people see that somebody is benefiting from the common pool resource in a way that's unfair, like they're benefiting just because some other powerful person likes them or because they're related to some powerful person, that will poison the pool. And people will say, you know what, forget it. The system's rigged. It's not fair. So I'm just going to exploit it, right? So in order to keep reciprocal trust going, you have to have a system in place where people are able to extract value that's proportional to the value that they bring to the enterprise. A third principle is what she calls collective choice arrangements. And this basically just means that group members have to have some way to create at least some of their own rules and to be able to make their own decisions by consensus. So this is sometimes called democratic decision making. Successfully managed common pool resources have institutions in place that allow the people who use the resource to be the ones who make the decisions about it. And this is basically, they put this down to a feature of human nature, that human beings hate being told what to do, but tend to be more inclined to work hard for group goals that they have agreed upon, that they, goals that they share in common and that they agree upon. So this is another way to think about this is in terms of autonomy. Successful common pool resource managements allow the people who use the resource to be autonomous, to make their own decisions about how the resource gets used and managed. The fourth general design principle that Ostrom extracts from successful common pool resource management is monitoring. To successfully manage a common pool resource, you have to be able to monitor or to keep track of other people's behavior, right? So managing a commons, like we talked about, it's inherently vulnerable to free riding and to people exploiting the common resource. And those strategies have to be detected by the rule following members, and they need to be able to do it at a relatively low cost. So I think this is also related. You could think of this as being related to the third principle, right? Because the idea is that the members are the ones who are making the decisions, and the members are also the ones who are doing the monitoring, right? So you have this scenario where there's a kind of mutual monitoring happening. And it's not like people are spying on their neighbors. It's just that people are aware of what their neighbors are doing and the extent to which they're making use of the common pool resource, and the extent to which their use of the common pool resource is proportional to the amount of value that they're putting into it. So that's the fourth principle. The fifth principle for successful common pool resource management is what they call graduated sanctions. So a sanction here in this context means like a punishment, and graduated means that you have levels of punishment, that they start out at a really low level, depending on, whatever the violation is. So they start out at a low level, but then they are graduated. They increasingly get more and more intense, especially initially. They can be, for example, like gossip, gentle reminders. Sometimes that's all you need to get somebody to get back in line, to observe the rules of the group. But they're graduated in the sense you also need to have more severe forms of punishment in place for people who are just free riders all the time and who are going to exploit the common pool resource. So you need graduated sanctions. That's the fifth principle. The sixth principle is that you need to have fast and fair conflict resolution mechanisms. When you're managing a common pool resource, there's inevitably going to be conflict. And so you have to have some kind of tribunal, some type of system in place to resolve conflict quickly and in ways that other members of the group perceive as fair. So fairness, again, is a really important issue here. You can't have somebody resolving the conflicts who's totally biased and always resolve the conflicts in favor of his own clan, right? That won't work. That will lead to more conflict and to further exploitation of the common resource. So you need an independent kind of tribunal that allows you to resolve conflicts in fair ways that everybody in the group perceives as fair. Okay, the seventh principle that she notices in successful common pool research management schemes is what she calls rights to organize. So she says that groups have to have the authority to conduct their own affairs. So this is connected to principle 3, right? So people don't want externally imposed rules. Externally imposed rules are very unlikely to be adapted to local circumstances because externally imposed rules, right, by their very nature, being external, they're not sensitive to the particular context that the people are actually living in. And externally imposed rules, like I said, violate principle 3, like violate the group's ability to autonomously create at least some of their own rules. Ostrom says successful systems for managing common pool resources also need to have the right for people to organize. When they feel like things are sort of going in the wrong direction, members of the group can join together to kind of change policy and to make it more effective for the group overall. And finally, the 8th principle is when you have really large common pool resources where you have multiple groups trying to manage different aspects of the resource. And so when you have different groups in a larger system working together, you need to have some kind of system in place for those groups to coordinate with each other. Because not only do you have intra-group conflict when you're managing a common pool resource, which is conflict among members of a group. If there's a very big common resource where there's multiple groups using it, then you can have intergroup conflict. And so you don't want any kind of sort of ongoing battle between two groups to happen, because basically war is bad for business. The idea here is that every sphere of activity will have an optimal scale, which means that there's a certain number of people that it's appropriate to have in a particular area managing a common pool resource of a particular size. And when that area gets too big, you'll need to have multiple groups managing it. And that kind of large scale governance requires finding the optimal scale for each sphere of activity so that people can coordinate their activities within the different groups. Okay, so those are the 8 principles of successful common pool resource management, according to Elinor Ostrom's research group. And those are the 8 principles that you are going to try to apply to your chosen common pool resource in your group activity.